From New York to our Bloomberg television and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. This is Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. We're going to start with a check on the markets right now. We're going to turn to Abigail Doolittle. So not a lot of action, a little softness, Abigail, but not a lot of action, it looks like.
Yeah, relatively quiet day. And to your point, David, volumes are well below the 20-day average. So a lot of traders, investors probably already heading toward their holiday break. But we have taken a small leg lower. And right now, the S&P 500 headed to its third down day in a row. So the bears trying to take a bit of control here. Now, on the upside, we have Apple. And that's one reason we don't have a bigger sell-off, because Apple, of course, one of the biggest components of the S&P 500 and the other major indexes, up 2.4% on a report that they may try to enter the electric vehicle market. On that, you have Tesla down for a second day. This, of course, after the company's been added to the S&P 500, some volatility. Also risk off. You have oil lower. In fact, right now heading to its first down week in 8 weeks. The week is relatively young. Nonetheless, this all has to do with fears around the new virus strain and the idea that lockdowns could go on longer than expected, and it could really hurt the economy. Another factor, though, to keep in mind, David, we have the dollar up for a third day in a row. In fact, the dollar is near session highs right now, up about 0.5%. And when you have that dollar climb, it's strong. It signals a strong U.S., but it can initially hurt some of the risk assets since they're denominated in dollars. So it'll be interesting to see whether or not that dynamic continues, David. Right now, I would say investors and traders really jockeying for position. It'll be interesting to see how this low volume day closes.
Exactly. As we go into the holidays, thank you so much to Abigail Doolittle for that report on the markets. Well, Congress did approve, finally voted out, that $900 billion stimulus package yesterday. It now was on its way to President Trump for his signature. We welcome one of those who voted for it. She is Congresswoman Chrissy Houlahan. She is a Democrat from Pennsylvania. Thank you so much, Congresswoman, for taking the time to be with us today. Give us your take on this package. I know it was not all that some Democrats had hoped for, had wanted. At the same time, it is $900 billion, the second largest stimulus package in the history of the United States of America.
So my take on it would be that this is a good first step. I don't believe that it will be the end-all, be-all, and I believe that we will most likely have to go back at this again in the new year with the new administration. But that is, to your point, it's an enormously large package with a lot of terrific help for small businesses, particularly to weather the rest of the next few weeks and into the winter time. So I'm happy to say that we were able to come to a bipartisan agreement with a pretty resounding positive vote, both from the House and from the Senate, and on to the president's desk, hopefully for signature.
Yeah, and Congresswoman, I'm curious about how we got there. There are various accounts now of exactly what the process was. As you know, I mean, 7 months ago, the House passed the HEROES bill, which was, I think, $3.3 trillion, something like that. But then there was this back and forth. It was in stasis for a long time. What actually broke the logjam in the end?
So I would argue that what broke the logjam is a group of bipartisan legislators that I'm a part of. It's called the Problem Solvers Caucus. It exists in the House, and it also has a bit of a presence in the Senate as well. And that group of folks put together a compromise package of sorts, kind of around the $908 billion mark, which was a really a long and arduous effort to sit down across the aisle and across the Congress to come up with a compromise. And that really started to break the logjam, I think, when I think the leadership on both sides of the aisle saw that there was an appetite for compromise. It was around that price tag of a 900 and something billion, and it was focused on things that we needed right this minute, like relief for our small businesses and paycheck protection program expansion and additions to that program.
Congressman, you said that you think this is a good first step, but it probably is not the last step. We may need more help as we get into the new year. I wonder about the prospects for that as a practical matter, given it was so difficult this time. Or on the other hand, did this process with the Problem Solvers Caucus, a bipartisan group of senators, does that give you something of a roadmap, particularly if, and we don't know if this will be the case, particularly if the Republicans hold control in the Senate, we're going to have a divided government. How difficult will it be to get something more done on stimulus?
So I'm hopeful that it is a bit of a roadmap of how we can better get along and better behave, not just bipartisanly, but bicamerally. This Problem Solvers Caucus has, as I mentioned, a presence in both of the chambers, and I think that that's significant. And the fact that we were able to blaze a path that made it possible to come up with a compromise, I think is hopeful for this coming administration. If Georgia, as you mentioned, goes the way where Republicans dominate in Georgia, I do hope that we have another opportunity to go back at this because, frankly, some of the things that my community asked for most were state and local support. I have a community that's purple, 40-40-20 Republican, Democrat, and Independent, one Democratic county and one Republican county. And both of those counties are desperate for that local aid and asked for that state and local aid, which ended up being kind of left on the cutting room floor along with liability protection. So I'm very hopeful that we end up being able to come back at that and finding a way to compromise on that as well.
Congresswoman, there's another story in Washington these days. It is this report of a major cyber attack, apparently from the Russians, on U.S. computer systems. That's U.S. government, but also private sector computer systems. You are on the Armed Services Committee. You yourself are a veteran of the United States Air Force. Give us your take right now. What do you understand about this attack? What should we be doing in response to it?
I think we should be concerned. In addition to being a veteran and on armed service and foreign affairs, I'm also an engineer, and there aren't a whole lot of people with STEM backgrounds in Congress right now. And I think that we collectively in Congress should be concerned about the vulnerabilities that we seem to be seeing across lots and lots of parts of our administration. So I believe that we need to get to the bottom of that. As you can probably appreciate, we've been a little bit distracted appropriately by COVID aid and COVID relief and also funding the government, which is the second thing that we did yesterday in the omnibus that we passed. And so I hope at this point those committees on the House and the Senate side will begin to turn their attention to oversight and asking for answers on those really important questions.
Yeah, it's an important point. By the way, in addition to $908 billion in the stimulus, you also had $1.4 trillion in funding the government through September, an awful lot on your platter. But looking forward now to a new administration, a new Congress, a new year, should we be rethinking our very structure in government about how we deal with cyber attacks? Because this seems to be coming more and more frequently and more seriously.
Yes, I believe so. It is actually one of the reasons why I was motivated to run for this particular office. I'm a freshman, so this will be the close of my freshman experience, my freshman year, and I really thought that cyber and frankly, bio vulnerabilities were something that we should be concerned about and spending more of our time and resources on. I serve on the Emerging Threats Subcommittee in the Armed Services Committee and also the Future of Defense Task Force, which are looking exactly at these kinds of issues, not just in our DoD, but also, as you mentioned, in the civilian sectors as well. With our private data and private information and with our corporate data and corporate information, we are vulnerable, and we need to be thinking about that pretty darn hard.
And part of it, as I understand it, is defense, figuring out how to defend ourselves. At the same time, it may be impossible fully to defend ourselves. So someone maybe also the possibility of taking action against those who are really trying to attack us. Do you have a sense about the extent to which we should do that quietly, secretly, or the extent to which we should go public as a country, as a nation, to say, this is what we're going to do to you if you come after us?
Yeah, that's a kind of an age-old conversation. How do you respond, and are you overt about it or covert about it? And proportionate response, and all of those kinds of conversations are those that have been being had already, and I would expect that we would continue to have them. I'm not certain how we will react to this particular intrusion, but those are definitely the ways that we think about how we respond, in general.
Okay, Congresswoman, thank you so much for taking the time. I hope you have a really great holiday. That's Congresswoman Chrissy Houlahan. She's Democrat from the state of Pennsylvania. Coming up here, we're going to talk with the Secretary of Commerce, Wilbur Ross, about what he's accomplished during his 4 years in office and what is yet to be done. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. One of President Trump's priorities as he came to office was really taking a look at and changing the terms of trade with China. And there's been a lot done. And one of those people who's been doing it has been the Secretary of Commerce. He is Wilbur Ross, and we welcome him now back to Bloomberg. Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for joining us. I want to talk about some of what you've accomplished this year and over these 4 years. And I thought we'd start with China because that's been a priority for you as well as for the president. Give us your take on what has been done with China.
Surely. Well, first of all, you have the Phase 1 deal, which was announced a while ago, that largely deals with commercial side of things, deals with agriculture, deals with manufactured products, deals with energy. So that was a very good thing. to level the playing field a bit. There still remains phase two, which largely has to do with better market access, more respect for intellectual property, that kind of thing that is harder to quantify, but at least as important in the overall picture. Meanwhile, we have been struggling to combat the rising military threat of China, both industrial espionage, taking militarily sensitive products, technology into China, and most recently we put 103 more companies on our list. That's a very big number. It's very precise in that these are the actual subsidiaries of big Chinese conglomerates that are part of the military establishment. We call them military end users. Prior to that, we had dealt with the issue of Huawei and ZTE for their violations and for the 5G competition springing up between China and ourselves. And then in between, we did a lot of things about semiconductors. Most recently, SMIC, Semiconductor Manufacturing Industry Corp., the largest of the Chinese semiconductor manufacturers. And then on the other side of the equation, we're trying to encourage a more robust semiconductor ecosystem here in the United States. And that was authorized in the National Defense Authorization Act that just went through. So those have been a few of the very dramatic things relating to China. In space, we have been extremely active as well.
Yeah, I want to talk about space as well, but on the subject of China for a moment, it has been dramatic. There's no question about that, and one of the items of drama have been imposition of tariffs. Looking back over it now, has the imposition of tariffs had the effected result that you wanted as a practical matter? Whether it's trade in goods like your phase one or more broadly, do you think it's really made a difference in our trading with China, or is this setting the stage for something yet to come?
Well, it's both. It has had accomplishment. The Chinese commitment, for example, to purchase agriculture is huge. And I believe it will turn out that this past year that's just ending will be the largest agricultural purchase year that China has ever had from the U.S. That's a very good thing because our farmers have been hurting. Remember, though, we have remained with tariffs on quite a lot of goods coming from China. And the major reason for that is to still have some trading room so that if we do get the kinds of concessions that are needed for the bigger issues, that we have something to give them potentially in exchange. So I think it was a very well-balanced use of tariffs, pulling off tariffs on some in a reciprocal way as they lowered their tariff and non-tariff trade barriers to us, but leaving some in reserve so that we can get the rest of the way. Because we must solve the technology problem, that we must solve the industrial espionage, we must solve the stealing of secrets in various ways, and we must solve their efforts to become the dominant military power at our expense.
And President Trump and you, I must say, have made that a priority, dealing with the industrial espionage, some of the theft of intellectual property, things like that. Can you measure that and see where we've actually made a difference, or has it not kicked in yet? I mean, is there less of it today than there was 4 years ago?
Well, they have passed some legislation that moves a little bit in the right direction, but big issues like market access still remain. So there is work to be done, and we knew that. Remember, this was not announced as a complete trade deal. This was announced as a phase one. So we and the Chinese both are well aware that there's much more to do, and hopefully that will happen in the coming periods.
Mr. Secretary, one of your priorities, we've talked about it before, is, if I can put it this way, the commercialization of space, really the business of space. Give us a sense of where we are on that right now, what progress we've made, and what is the next step that needs to take place?
Well, there's been tremendous progress made. Remember, back in 2010-11, we launched 0 rockets from the United States. President Obama had made arrangements for the Russians to launch the rockets, including the rockets that carry our astronauts to our space station, most recently charging us $85 million per ride. But in the 2010-11 period, some very wealthy people decided they were going to try to commercialize space. And the president has now ratified that with the new space command on the military side and the other activities on the commercial side. The committee has delegated to Commerce a lot of the role for commercialization of space through our Office of Space Commerce. And I'm happy to say that the National Defense Authorization Act has authorized a very big increase in the budget for the Office of Space Commerce. They've a little bit more than doubled it. And they also approved on an authorization basis the merger into that office of the current regulatory apparatus for remote sensing. The remote sensing is the looking down from satellites for GPS purposes, for weather purposes, for all kinds of purposes. So those are two very important moves because they will ultimately, we think, lead to better space traffic awareness, better space situational awareness, and very much improved space traffic management. We're in the midst of a transition from the Air Force, which is not wanting to retain that function. They want to give it to us. And we're well along toward the transition where we will be responsible for communicating those factors that could lead to what they call conjunctions, what you and I would call collisions in outer space, as thousands and thousands more objects whirl around in orbit at more than 10,000 miles an hour, posing great risk to our astronauts in the space station, posing great risk to hundreds of billions of dollars of capital investment, and potentially interfering with communications to Earth. So space traffic management is going to become an increasingly important part of making space more commercial. The other part that's been helping it hugely has been reusability. The reusability of launch mechanisms, reusability of other parts, and one size fits all. That's bringing down the cost of space. So we're going to go from $450 billion space economy to $1 trillion.
Mr. Secretary, I don't want to let you go without asking you about one subject. It's not really directly in your responsibility, but you are a senior official in the U.S. government, and that's this cyber attack reportedly from Russia. Now, I understand there's an ongoing investigation. We don't know exactly what happened, but can you give us a sense from inside the government of the priority being given to this, of figuring out exactly what happened, who did it, and what we need to do about it? What is being done?
Well, there's a lot being done, but since it's a work in progress, I'm really not at liberty to discuss it. But I can assure you it is a very top priority of the intelligence community, of Homeland Security, of the affected departments, and of the president and the vice president themselves. This is a very serious situation. It's a very widespread hacking and a very sophisticated one.
Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary. One last short question. You mentioned the NDAA, that Defense Authorization Act. Is there any question the president will sign it? Because he suggested once he might veto it.
Well, that is obviously up to him. As you know, it passed both houses with overwhelming bipartisan support. And so I would hope that he would consider looking at it favorably. But he's the president. There's only one president at a time, and it's his decision what to do.
That's very well said. There is only one president at a time. Really appreciate all the time that you spent with us. Thank you so much. That's Wilbur Ross. He is the Secretary of the Department of Commerce. And this is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. After a tumultuous year in Washington, Congress now has the opportunity to leave town to go back home for the holidays, having done an awful lot right at the very end, as yesterday they approved both a $1.4 trillion spending package that'll take the government right through September, and then a $908 billion stimulus package that have been debated back and forth and up and down. This even as we are waiting to find out who will control the Senate based on those special elections coming up in Georgia just 2 weeks from today. We talked about all that with the number 2 Democrat in the Senate. He is Dick Durbin of Illinois. But we also talked to him about that cyber attack and how important it is. This is what he had to say in part about the cyber attack.
We have to make it clear to the Russians, this is unacceptable at every level, and there is a price to pay for it. Whether that price is ever publicly disclosed, I don't know. But I'm counting on the next administration to take Vladimir Putin seriously. I don't know why there's, as one Republican said, such a blind spot in the White House when it comes to Putin.
That was Senator Dick Durbin talking to us yesterday. He's Democrat from Illinois. And of course, he was referring to Republican Senator Mitt Romney talking about a blind spot over the weekend that President Trump apparently has with Republicans. We'll have more with Senator Durbin coming up later in this hour as we talk about the stimulus package, what comes next, and those Georgia runoffs. In the meantime, right here, we're going to be talking with Deval Patrick, former governor of the state of Massachusetts. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It's time now for Bloomberg First Word News. And for that, we go to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. 2 top health officials were vaccinated against COVID-19 today. Dr. Anthony Fauci and Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar were given Moderna's shot. Dr. Fauci, who turns 80 on Thursday, noted that he's getting the vaccine partly because he still sees patients, but also to send a message to the country that he feels, quote, extremely confident in the safety and efficacy of the vaccine. Now it's up to President Trump. White House aides say the president will sign a giant spending bill that combines coronavirus relief, regular government funding, and tax breaks for businesses. The Senate gave final approval last night. There's $900 billion in economic relief, the second largest such measure in U.S. history. Most Americans will get a one-time $600 payment, plus enhanced unemployment benefits will be extended. The European Union has rejected Prime Minister Boris Johnson's latest concessions on fishing rights, dealing a setback to efforts to secure a post-Brexit trade deal. Bloomberg's Maria Tadeo caught up with the EU's chief Brexit negotiator, Michel Barnier, in Brussels and asked him about the state of the talks.
We are really in a crucial moment, and we are giving it a final push. In 10 days, the UK will leave the single market, and I will continue to work in total transparency with the member states right now and with the Parliament.
With only 9 days left before the UK leaves the single market and customs union, there are few signs a deal is within reach. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. Well, 2 weeks from today, we'll have those final 2 runoff races in the state of Georgia for 2 Senate seats, with the control of the Senate hanging in the balance. And thus far, at least the polls we have indicate the races are extremely close. Welcome now former governor of Massachusetts. He is Deval Patrick. He's also the co-chair of American Bridge 21st Century. Sorry, Governor. American Bridge 21st Century. That is a Democratic super PAC that's very active, as I understand it, Governor, in Georgia. Tell me what you're doing down there.
Well, first of all, David, thank you for having me. And just as we were active in the general election by investing in rural communities in some 80 counties in Wisconsin, in Michigan, and in Pennsylvania that had voted once or twice for Obama and then for Trump, and in a very respectful way over time, inviting people back by using their own voices, asking people to create a sort of a permission structure. We're doing the same thing in rural Georgia. A large part of the population live outside of metro Atlanta. Most of the focus and a lot of the media spend, for example, has been there. And through both very respectful ads that are targeted for communities in rural Georgia, and with a real focus on the 2nd Congressional District down in southwestern Georgia, and partnering with grassroots groups who are talking to voters and inviting them in. We're trying to do our part to make sure that everybody has a chance to make their vote count and have their civic voice heard in one of the most important senatorial elections in a long, long while.
So, Governor, as you say, you have experience now in places like Michigan and Pennsylvania from the general election. What did you learn about rural voters? I mean, we hear a lot about suburban voters for Democrats, but what did you learn about rural voters and what they care about? What could either motivate them to come out and vote or change their vote?
Well, with the qualification that rural voters, just like any other sort of class of voters, are not a monolith. They don't all think the same thing or approach politics the same way. I would say that the economic fragility or uncertainty, the social isolation, the despair as measured by, addiction rates or suicide rates, and the sense that those issues are seen and cared about at election time and then not in between elections, is exactly the same thing that we saw in the general, and frankly that I've seen in Black communities for generations. And so I do think that, and I say this more personally than officially on behalf of American Bridge, that Democrats suffer from not having a permanent grassroots infrastructure. It's one of the things that I want to focus on going forward, how we build that sense of civic engagement year round, every year, and not just around politics or a given election. But I think that it's been enormously important to approach folks in rural communities, just as it would be anywhere, respectfully, not wagging a finger at them and telling them they were wrong to vote Republican or wrong to support Donald Trump, but asking them to consider what the needs are of their community, their state, and their country right now, and in their own way and in their own voice to find a way to support John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock in the runoffs in Georgia.
Governor, as you say, this is one of the more consequential pair of Senate races that I can remember, certainly, because the fate of the Senate really hangs in the balance. Who will have the majority in the Senate? As you talk to rural voters down in Georgia, do they see this as a national election or a local election? As you talk about their personal concerns, do they identify it with the national question and what, for example, a Biden administration could do for them in rural Georgia?
Well, I think, it's interesting. I'm hearing 2 points in your question, David, and both of them are important as I have experienced it. I think this is a runoff election of national consequence, but it's also an election of consequence for Georgians. Georgians need health care available in rural communities, and rural hospitals have been under threat. They need Medicaid expanded under the ACA so that they can afford that healthcare where and when it is available. They need an economic future And we have not had an industrial policy to speak of in the United States for decades. And it's been leaving a lot of people in rural communities behind. That is not just a problem from Trump years, although I think much of this has been exacerbated by neglect, if nothing more, during the Trump years. So issues around an economic future that includes people in rural communities, issues around access to healthcare and affordable education, so that and affordable housing for that matter, so that people are able to lift themselves and their families and move forward. That's the case that Democrats always make. We don't always make it as sharply as I'd like, but it's the opportunity that the incoming Biden administration and senators and House members working in collaboration can deliver. I do think that we want to be careful not to make folks in rural Georgia, or frankly anywhere else in Georgia, feel that the only significance, or the primary significance, is the national one, meaning who gets to control the Senate, on the probably false assumption that Democrats will vote as a block on every issue. I think that's wrong. I think it's really important.
Finally, Governor, briefly, what do you make of the Biden cabinet? Who's picked for his cabinet, and what kind of fights do you think there might be in the Senate over it?
Over confirmations, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, I think first of all, I think that the president-elect and the vice president-elect have been pitch perfect from the day of the election. Everything they've said, everything they've done has been really about asking us to turn to each other rather than on each other. And it's such an important message right now. I think he's been choosing terrific people, talented people, and loyalists for his administration. People who are deep in subject matter, but also deep in their relationships with him and with his team. And that seems to me to make sense. I'm sure there's going to be back and forth with the Senate over confirmation. I presume, based on what I have read so far, that most of that will be theatrics and not real substance, because, as I say, every one of these people have deep subject matter experience, and in many cases, deep political experience, and are known to be people of integrity. And I think if you believe the president should have the team he wants, then the nominees will be confirmed.
Governor, thank you so much for your time. Always a pleasure having you with us. I hope you have a great holiday.
I hope you do.
Former Governor of Massachusetts, Deval Patrick, and he is, of course, co-chair of American Bridge 21st Century. Coming up here, we're going to talk about what the consequence of the new phase of the coronavirus crisis might mean for the UK economy with Stephanie Flanders. She's Senior Executive Editor for Economics here at Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. I'm David Weston. Well, the United Kingdom has entered yet a new phase of lockdown, even more stringent, after they detected a new strain of the coronavirus there, which appears to be more contagious than others. And it's really led to disruption, including in business and in trade, as well as in people's lives. To take us through the economic consequences of this, we welcome now Stephanie Flanders. She's Senior Executive Editor for Economics at Bloomberg. So, Stephanie, thank you so much for being with us. Give us a sense of what this is doing to the economy. We see trucks lined up at Dover. It appears there's a substantial disruption to the economy right now.
Yeah, it really seems like a sort of doomsday scenario almost, when you have a major port closed, which obviously is responsible for a big chunk of Britain's particularly fresh fruit and veg at this time of year. And there's also a lot of meat that's stuck on this side trying to get over the channel. Obviously, we worry about how long that's even going to keep. I think we've had, as you know, David, there's been disruption and certainly a lot of build-up and bottlenecks across the world in ports because of the way that trade has picked up very quickly and not enough ships to take all of this freight. So you then have cargo piling up at the ports outside the UK, but that was already happening at Dover before you had the decision by the French to close the port. And there are literally thousands of trucks there now, and we're now wondering what on earth is going to happen to them. As you know, negotiations happening. But you're right that the significance for the economy could be very significant, combined with the new lockdowns which were announced in the last couple of days, which really affect. Maybe it's only a chunk of the English population, but it's responsible for about 85% of Britain's GDP. So it's a big deal.
It was triggered originally by France, as I understand it, saying, forget about the travel. We don't want goods going back and forth either. Apparently now President Macron is backing off of that and saying we're going to start up the trade once again. At the same time, are there longer term consequences we should anticipate, no matter almost what happens with Brexit?
Well, exactly. So we know that even if, we talk about sort of no deal versus deal, but the kind of deal that we're looking at has always been one that suggested a big increase in customs regulations, a big increase in the need for both sides to inspect goods coming in and out. Now, the British have always said, they've sort of fudged this. They've said, we won't actually do the increased inspection on European goods coming in for 6 months, to try and avoid that kind of hit in the short term. But the Europeans are legally obliged to do all their checks from day one, and they have insisted they will do that. So already you have had a lot of hauliers and truck drivers say, you know what, we're going to steer clear of the UK ports for a few months to see how this shakes out. So that was already causing strain and worry, and that's in the good scenario that we get a deal. And as you know, we haven't got a deal yet.
And Stephanie, give us a sense of what the tools are in the toolkit and whose toolkit is it? Because it's not clear exactly to me what the Bank of England could do to help the situation. What can Boris Johnson do?
Well, so our economists are now predicting, on the basis of this new lockdown, a double-dip recession, with the UK economy shrinking again in the last three months of this year and the first 3 months of 2021. We hadn't quite got there previously because we thought you would get quite a pickup in the first quarter despite Brexit. But with that, we know that there is quite a lot of support, even though output may shrink. We've had all along through this pandemic this support coming from governments for incomes. So the furlough scheme that's employing this big chunk of the UK workforce, with the government picking up the tab, that carries on now through April. It's been extended even longer. There's other forms of support for business. So in a sense, everything that's going to be supporting the economy is already happening. And there's not much the Bank of England can do about a long line of trucks at Dover, or lockdowns preventing people from purchasing services or going to restaurants. They're just going to have to hang tight and make sure that confidence is still there when we get through the pandemic.
And Stephanie, finally, give me a sense of the compliance on the part of the British citizens right now. Here in the United States, as you know, we have some people who don't want to comply. We've seen some of it in continental Europe. Are the British being more compliant with some of the strict lockdown than maybe we've seen other places?
I think there's been a similar thing across Europe where initially compliance was very high, but once, if confidence is lost in the reasoning behind it and the scientific basis and indeed the leaders that are announcing it, then obviously one starts to worry that people aren't going to follow. I would say the British have surprised on the upside in actually supporting restrictions and following them. But certainly the younger population, there's been quite a lot of breaches already. I think people are sort of holding their breath to see what happens at Christmas, because there is a great feeling of unease and resentment of the way the government has continually changed its tune. So it's a difficult time to have leaders in whom people seem to have very little confidence.
That's something I think we can share around the world right now, I'm afraid. Thank you so much, Stephanie. It's always a treat to have you with us. That's Stephanie Flanders. She's Senior Executive Editor for Economics right here at Bloomberg. Coming up, we're going to have more with our conversation with Dick Durbin. He is the Minority Whip, the #2 ranking Democrat in the Senate. He's the Democrat from the state of Illinois. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Yesterday, we got to sit down with Dick Durbin. He's the Senate Minority Whip, to talk to him about his views about the Georgia elections, as well as what's coming up with the stimulus.
We're feeling optimistic, but let me put a note of caution in this. The polling data that we received for the last major election, November 3rd election, was really misleading. We expected a lot different, and the Republicans did as well. The ones I've spoken to said our polling wasn't very accurate either. So there are some basics, some skepticism about polling results. When we look at the trends in polling, and if you go to the same pollster, taking the same type of sample, and look at what happens over a period of time, the trends are leaning in our direction. But I wouldn't go any further. I don't think polling is the indicator it once was.
If, in fact, Democrats don't capture both seats, which is what you need, basically, to have effective control in the Senate, and you're looking forward to a split Congress, with Republicans still having perhaps a very narrow majority on the Senate, is there anything in your experience on this round, this $900 billion round, that would inform or encourage you that maybe there is a way for Republicans and Democrats to work together on what may be necessary for another round come the new year?
Well, yes, I think there is. And consider, this started about 3 or 4 weeks ago with 8 senators. I was one of them, 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans, eating dinner at a safe social distance in someone's living room and talking about whether or not we could break the deadlock on COVID relief. We did it. In 3 weeks, we put together a bill. We introduced it a week ago. And look where we are today. We're talking about enacting this into law and making a major impact on the economy. It was a group of 8 senators that grew to 11 or 12 ultimately that really was a moving force. I think grassroots bipartisan force and energy can make a difference in the Senate, regardless of who's in charge.
This has been obviously perhaps the big issue in Washington over the last week or two. There is, though, another big story, which is the report of this cyber attack on government computer systems, but also on private companies' computer systems. We still don't have, I think, a good sense of how big it is, how far it goes, what needs to be done. Thus far from President Trump, the only thing I've seen so far is a tweet suggesting, well, it's under control and maybe it wasn't the Russians. Is that hurting the attempts to try to get our arms around the problem that the president doesn't seem to be making it a priority?
Listen, the president will soon be gone and a new president will be sworn in. And I know that president, Joe Biden, is going to take this very seriously. We should not translate the silence of the White House to this major disclosure of intrusion into our cybersecurity as an indication that it isn't serious. It is very serious. We don't know the depth of it yet. We have to spend a lot of time and analyze it. But we are vulnerable in ways we never imagined. We've spent billions of dollars, obviously with limited success in protecting ourselves. What's at risk is literally the defense of this country, the national security. And we've got to take it seriously. We have got to make it clear to the Russians and to the rest of the world that we're very serious about protecting these assets.
Even in the time before President Biden is inaugurated on January the 20th, could we be doing some damage in not acting more aggressively in the meantime? Or are we acting aggressively in the meantime? Are we doing what needs to be done to ferret it out and figure out what it is and start to take some defensive actions?
As of a few days ago, we were just discovering new businesses and agencies that have been compromised. So we are in the midst of this maelstrom, and to suggest that we have it under control or a plan to get it under control, I think is wrong. We have got to assess this in terms of the depth and seriousness of the threat, and we've got to make amends. The investments we've made to this point did not work. There was a massive failure at some level, and we've got to be prepared to get to the bottom of it.
Well, and Senator, it's not the first time this has happened, not the first time it's happened for the Russians, for the U.S. government. We had this back in the late 90s. We had some of these attacks. Under President Obama, they got access to certain cabinet officials' communications. So what do we need to do to make this a priority for our country, to try to do what needs to be done to defend ourselves, or at least to deter people from wanting to do it?
Well, I heard one of the experts this morning just make a confession and say, we have got to concede the fact that the Russians are very good at this, much better than we thought they were. We also have to concede that the approach that we're taking did not keep us safe. I mean, those are 2 starting premises for some very massive investment of people and resources to answer this. In the meantime, we have to make it clear to the Russians, this is unacceptable at every level, and there is a price to pay for it. Whether that price is ever publicly disclosed, I don't know. But I'm counting on the next administration to take Vladimir Putin seriously. I don't know why there's, as one Republican said, such a blind spot in the White House when it comes to Putin.
That was Senator Dick Durbin, Democrat of Illinois, who is the second-ranking Democrat in the U.S. Senate. By the way, you heard him refer to that get-together, the informal dinner at somebody's living room to try to bring together this bipartisan support for the stimulus bill. The reports now are that it was actually Lisa Murkowski's living room that they went to. They were socially distanced and they had the windows open. It was up on Capitol Hill. And that was actually the first kernels of pulling together this compromise that ended up happening. In the meantime, when it comes to the question of that cyber attack, we're going to continue to talk about that in our second hour of Balance of Power. We have a scholar from the University of Virginia who talks about whether whatever the United States does should be done publicly or should be done quietly behind closed doors. And we also have an economist, Michael Strain, here, who analyzes the payroll protection plan that is now in the new stimulus bill. What makes sense? What doesn't make so much sense? That's coming up in our second hour. And this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.